Thanks, everybody. Thanks for hanging in with us on a Friday afternoon, a gorgeous Friday afternoon. I wouldn't blame anybody if you wanted to just go walk in Central Park, but we're going to have a stimulating conversation about the on-demand world. See, it's all on demand. They know they can watch it whenever they want. So seriously, thank you all very much for coming to us to our conference on a Friday afternoon here. Real quick, just going to go down the row and introduce people, and then we'll get into our conversation. Starting with Nick Ascheim, who is Senior Vice President of NBC News Digital, which is, I know, a big revved-up operation within the news division. It'd be interested to talk to you about that. Next to Nick is Sean Cohan, President of Digital for A&E Networks. Next to Sean is, Jason Flick, thanks, CEO and founder of You.i TV. We're going to hear more about You.i TV. Next to Jason is Sagan Govender, head of news for Amazon's Alexa, which we've all been hearing about all day so far. And next to Sagan is Rob Gill, president of product management for JW Player. And next to Rob is Walt Horstman, senior vice president and general manager of advanced media and advertising for TiVo. The whole morning and early afternoon here, we've been talking about the variations on the theme of we're in a world that has shifted from linear entertainment to digital content to the on-demand world and the ability of audiences to program, set their own schedules. The industry has been talking about this and has really been transformed is in the midst of a transformation by that. For this group, which is focused on people who are proactively programming for an on-demand audience, I guess that would be my question. How do you program for an audience that you don't know when they may or may not, when they may be coming to see your product? How do you program entertainment, news, information content for a purely on-demand audience? It's a jump ball. I throw it out. Any of you?
Well, I can start because I think for news it's probably a little easier. You program for an on-demand audience, I think, very similarly to a non-on-demand audience. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but the news dictates when people are going to come looking. So you have to be ready, obviously, all the time, and you have to be up to date all the time when you're programming for news. But I do think that if there was a period of time between linear and where we are now where you could sort of get away with not obeying traditional programming rules and just kind of put things out there and hope for the best, because it was hard to find content, it was hard to access content, players didn't work, and that sort of thing. I'm talking specifically about video, or at least mostly about video. But now, technology has caught up. It is so much easier for people to do, as you said, is to kind of program their own experiences. They expect a rich variety, and they expect an ease of use, and they expect everything to work. So I think we're back to where we used to be, which is it's got to be good, it's got to be interesting, it's got to be memorable, it's got to be something that they can find again if they're looking for it. There has to be consistency to it, and it has to be unbelievably high quality. And I think the era of hiding behind the sort of foibles of the internet is over.
And I think mixing the two, and I think we chatted about this a little bit, we went too extreme, right? It was like what you want, when you want, how you want it, but really there is some of the good things about analog that make sense. Give me some content, show me it, let me experience it, and then how do you build an experience on top of the video maybe if the video is going to be playing all the time, right? And which is much what we're used to in the analog world.
And I would just add, outside of news, with a brand like History, what we think about is trying to be really topical, trying to be kind of very close to, at times even leading the cultural conversation, or in providing context around the news. Providing the deeper dive when our president says something about Mexico, well, providing video content around the background around Mexico, or Colin Kaepernick gets on one knee. It's thinking about the history around the protests before sporting events and the Black Panther salute as part of the Olympics 50 years ago. So I think there's a topicality that's possible in addition to just making sure, as you said, Nick, that you're super quality, because there's a hell of a lot of content out there, and it's really difficult to cut through.
Yeah, I would add to that too. I mean, once you've captured the audience because of a news event and it's on demand, it's how can you keep that audience engaged, right? So it's having good metadata around your video, being able to deliver that video performantly so they're not upset with the experience, a bad experience, surfacing via recommendation, like the right next video, to keep them engaged, keep them on the site, build a rapport with that person so they come back.
Yeah, and I think the idea of having personalized recommendations is absolutely critical, because if you're programming, we have so much content available, more than ever before, right? In fact, we've got a content clutter. In fact, we did some interesting research where we surveyed people and asked, how long does it take when you go into a programming environment to get to the content that you're interested in? And people survey say about 10 minutes. And when you look at the actual data based on the work that we're doing with personalized recommendations, it's about 5 minutes. So there's a big disconnect in the consumer's mind about how challenging it is to get to the content they want. And I think that's really what the burden is upon us to solve that problem.
Yeah, we see that actually a lot in the data we see from our publishers and in the video content and the metadata around those videos. You can't have good recommendations. You can't surface that without good metadata around that content. And it sounds obvious, but like percentage is usually really, really low on like good thumbnail, good description, good title. And so being able to use machine learning and other algorithms to actually generate that without an editor having to do it, we found makes a huge difference.
Saigon, do you see Alexa as a navigation and curation of entertainment and news content as a big growth area for Alexa?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're big believers on voice UI, as you can imagine, and we've seen some really interesting things in terms of data points, right? One is sort of more general level of voice UI. We've not only seen a tremendous sort of growth in our customer base, but Alexa is connecting with customers in a very sort of special kind of way. If we look at our customer reviews, we literally have tens of thousands of reviews that contain the word love, right? Which is just amazing from our side. As far as content on Alexa, thinking back to 2014 when we first launched, we launched with an initial news experience, and there were only 2 or 3 sort of providers at that time. Today we have over 4,000 providers, and really that's been a response to the tremendous positive customer feedback we've got around engaging with news through voice UI. And a few of the folks here have said it already, but you want to make sure you provide all of the selection and the long tail that you can, and the personalization and recommendations are there to pair the customer with the right piece of content. The last thing I'd say about sort of voice UI specifically here is it's just incredible at engaging new segments of the audience, right? It's what some people call a natural UI, where you don't have to learn how to use it. You just speak as you normally would, and Alexa will understand and do that, right? So what you see is folks like my nephew, who's just a few years old. He's never used a smartphone or any sort of news app or anything like that, but or app in general, but he's able to interact with Alexa. And the same goes for folks that have just been left behind by technology, where they didn't sort of jump on the smartphone bandwagon. They're able to, again, engage with technology and content through Alexa just because there's nothing to learn.
And I think the interesting about Alexa, what it does too, is it's creating kind of a Chromeless experience, right? So the biggest win is you speak it and it does it, right? But then if you look at, and we've got some big media brands here, how do you embrace that? If it's just going to be talking and a video shows up, how do you engage in that player, right? When there's almost a Chromeless interface, right?
Yeah.
I'd be curious, do you have any data, or do you track any data for Alexa in terms of, you must track the types of instructions that users give to it. Do you have any sense of how often users are asking Alexa for, find me this show, find me this news story on this topic? I'd be curious if you have anything like that.
Sure. So for all our providers, we provide aggregated metrics, right? Just at a general level, how often your piece of content is being engaged with. And we are always seeking for ways to empower our providers to make better content through better analytics. But
in the scheme of everything that somebody might use Alexa for, do you have a sense of how much of it is content, seeking content?
Oh, sure. I can say this, right? News is one of our most engaged with experiences on Alexa. It's clearly a core and important experience, and something that we're doubling down on.
Oh, I was just going to add, one of the most interesting parts of the platform is not even necessarily as a gateway to content that's been previously kind of created for another means, but I think of things like This Day in History, which is a skill we created where we're literally, it's just a very different way for a content maker, we make content for it, but very different way for a content player to interact with the consumer. So yes, it's about discovery of content that exists in the ecosystem, but it's also just, I think it's an interesting marketing extension, and ultimately, I'm hoping, I think we're all hoping, a little bit of a monetization play as well.
Do you see that as an onboarding? Do you use that to get them into your other properties, or is that a one-off?
No, I think, well, ideally, it can be it's part of a bigger ecosystem, because we say, well, Alexa, what happened this day in history? And then you go through a whole thing, and I don't mean to be overly commercial, but then you get to the bottom of it, and then, and if you're interested in more, go to history.com. But in reality, even if they don't get to that, they've interacted with your brand, they're developing a habit around the brand, and in our partnership and other content players' partnerships with Alexa, I would guess, there's lots of other places that you can lead them within the Alexa kind of world that'll be additive or strategic for both partners.
Absolutely. And Sean, I'm just curious so within A&E Networks, you have people creating specific content to respond to an Alexa prompt, or content that is SEO searchable that would likely fit with that?
It's a little bit of I would say it's a little bit of a kind of a hybrid between what you're saying. I mean, we have a long tradition of content around this day in history. And so what we've been able to do is develop what they call a skill or an app around providing that information. Or we also have trivia quizzes that we've actually got 3 skills on Alexa now. Ultimate history trivia quiz, or great speeches. So in some cases we're creating the content. In more cases we're creating like the packaging and kind of purposing the content to be best kind of used or consumed via Alexa.
Yeah, and I think the most successful providers are the ones that do what you guys are doing, and really create content that's working backwards from the customer and how they're engaging with voice, where they are in the home when they're engaging with the content. For instance, by far the most popular use case is the customer in the morning getting ready to sort of leave to work or go to school, and wanting the sort of quick updates on the news, right? And so you design content around that, and you'll be more successful. And I see that that specific use case even changes over time, right? As Alexa sort of goes out onto more endpoints, we've been very open, and partners have been very open about sort of bringing Alexa to their various different interfaces, like Sonos or cars or TVs. That changes the way you think about content. And I'd use the car as the example. If you're able to get content through Alexa through the car, you've got about 45 minutes there with the customer, right? And so the type of content you deliver there is very different than that quick summary content that you have in the morning at home.
Yeah, and just to add to that, in terms of the growth rate of content discovery using video, we're seeing that the deployments that we have, because we work with the service providers to actually support their natural language understanding, so through the set-top box, which is still a predominant delivery mechanism for video, is that just in the last quarter, growth in usage using conversation is up 60%, from just people starting to get engaged with it, using that as the new means of how they want to discover content, even just saying something like, what's on TV tonight, and being able to serve up, based on past viewership, this is what we think that you are interested in watching tonight, based on what you used to watch, or based on other shows that are related to this. It is tremendous how quickly the adoption is of this mechanism to get to content.
Nick, I was going to ask you, I know within NBC News there's been a big push on all fronts to really rev up the digital operation. I mean, the NBC News infrastructure is delivering news 24/7 online, a lot more breaking news. Can you talk about how the importance of being in part of this conversation that we're talking about has influenced that investment in that initiative within the news division?
Yeah, I think this idea of being available all the time, it's obviously something that we're fairly used to, having had a cable channel around for quite a while now, but the ways that people are finding us and the ways that people are accessing us is something that we are thinking about constantly. and being in new places and new environments. So in the last year, we've launched both an experimental documentary unit, in part because we really want to understand how people are discovering content on YouTube that goes beyond the sort of traditional cat videos, but how are people finding what I would consider to be premium, higher-end content on YouTube and building an audience for that. We've also launched a show on Snapchat called Stay Tuned, which is aimed at a much younger audience. And that's a whole other platform for us. It's a whole other way of producing content, and it's a whole other way of reaching an audience. And we've managed now to build a fairly consistent audience, about 30 million people, 75% of whom are under the age of 25, who probably would never experience any NBC News content, and in some cases, any news content at all, if they weren't finding this show. So all of this is incredibly relevant to us. And just even on the voice interface stuff, so Alexa is a tremendous platform. I have many in my house, and my kids are slightly older than your nephew, and they're having a very different kind of conversation with Alexa right now. But I also am an Xfinity customer in addition to being employed by Comcast, and the voice remote it's an absolute game changer. And Xfinity has now started to come to us and say, how do we start playing around with voice being the connection between somebody and news? And so we're just beginning to think about that as you start to marry up the device with the big screen, voice, people's intent, recommendations, algorithms. What does that all look like? And hopefully we'll be here in a year talking about some interesting stuff.
It feels like we really are inching toward that connected, completely wired house that has always been the fabled thing off in the horizon. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting if people are looking at voice as a separate one, but I think you have to look at it as a part of a whole portfolio, right? That's what, even if you're building an app or maybe a website, you're looking at the X1, you've got to think about it as how it fits into the whole ecosystem, which I think we're not quite there yet. I don't think people are thinking broad enough. Maybe some people here are, but it affects all of your properties, right? It's not its own silo.
And it has to, as we've talked about, on top of everything else, it has to be relevant, it has to look great, and it has to be there in, 5 minutes to search something. 5 minutes in our world seems like an eternity, an absolute eternity. I would imagine that you guys at JW Player and at You.i TV have really been putting a lot of emphasis into making that navigation and the serving up of all this great content,
Yeah, I mean, one thing we
As
see a
good as
lot, mentioned the recommendations earlier, it's one is performance has an enormous impact. Video on the internet has not been the best performing user experience for a long time, but it's constantly getting better, and it's our primary focus. But then also the UI, it sounds somewhat silly, but like we've done a lot of A/B testing around why someone engages with a video. Is it a particular thumbnail that someone wants to click on? Is it how it's presented to them? Is it a play button versus the words click to play? And we've seen that makes an enormous difference. So people click on click to play way more than they click on just the play button. So you can have the most amazing content, you can surface it, but if it's not a good experience, people aren't going to interact with it, and then they probably won't come back. We see a big drop off if it's a bad experience.
And of course, all this content comes with lots of data attached. I realize it's probably early days for both of you in the world of having a very robust linear operation. But are you learning a lot about your audiences? I'm curious, Nick and Sean, from what you can see from the online activity that you can track through your proprietary sites.
Yeah, what I think is interesting is, I think we've always programmed with a little bit of data, but didn't really call it that, and didn't really necessarily credit ourselves or any of our peers did. And so back in the day, we'd find, Vikings as a show originally came out of, for example, one of the most watched versions of our episodes of one of our documentary shows. Or Ice Road Truckers came out of, again, a Modern Marvels episode that was highly rated. So we always tended to program with data, but never called that. I think fast forward now, and I think even just the basics with a brand like History, we can do things like, we can study the most likely searches on Google. Right? Just again, very basic, and then and make content, program around that, or study what students are, what their curriculum looks like, and the seasonality of that, and actually online really put out or press on those topics that we think they're going to be searching around. So yeah, I think it's early days, and I think we're very realistic about what we as a programmer can do versus what some of the other players with a lot more access to data. Whether it's attachment to Comcast or the folks at Amazon, they have a ton more access to data, but I think there's even just very basic tactical things that you can do today that you could not do before. And I think before we were using data, but we just weren't maybe thinking about it quite that way.
And I think sports is going to lead a lot of this, right? So the data, I know we've talked about, it is kind of crazy in this day and age how little data we have on some of the assets, but sports has it, right? There's tons of real-time data all the time. So I think you're going to see some really cool sporting apps where it's rich, down, get lots of detail, go up, maybe other sporting events. But I think that one, and that will create the behavior that I think other areas can embrace. But that's an area where it seems crazy to me that we're still doing a very linear feed tied to a general audience, where I think there's so much opportunity to rethink that experience.
Yeah, and I think we're learning, using the data, so much about people's behavior with respect to what content they're interested in, even by behavior that's different by day of week. So when we serve up recommendations, we find that they're much more successful Monday through Friday based on catching up with existing programming, or actually within a tighter genre. But then on the weekends, people are much more interested in exploring. And so we use as an opportunity with a content provider to expand the repertoire of the catalog that they're interested in, because people have that lean back, I'm sort of not rushed, I have more time on my hands. And so when we recommend a broader set of content, we find that that's much more successful. And it even varies depending on the device, such as a mobile device has a much more narrow focus from most consumer behavior, whereas with the linear TV experience, a broader experience like on the weekends. So all of this really starts to inform the nuances of different consumer behavior, which really helps us, which is what we want to need to do is effective content marketing and merchandising now with all this data.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just because I think the where and when data is incredibly important in figuring out which piece of content to put in front of what audience at what time. I get a little nervous when you start talking about using data to figure out the what. I think the kind
in news that can be tricky.
In news, and yes, and news adjacent content. I think I think if you go too far down the data rabbit hole, you end up missing an opportunity to create great content and give the audience an opportunity to discover things they might not have otherwise. But things like Saturday mornings, people are going to consume for a longer period of time. Serve them up bigger, longer pieces of video than you would on a Friday evening when they're trying to catch up before they go out. I think that is exactly the right way to approach data.
Yeah, we see something really similar across our network. So if we categorize all the video content flowing through our player or our platform by like IAB categories to know what type of content it is, you cross that over with when people are watching that content and maybe where they referred from. So did they come from Facebook? Did they come from Google back to someone's O&O site to watch that content? It's consistent. It's, you see people are coming from Google in the morning, looking at news, things like that. Facebook in the afternoon, Facebook at night, more entertainment type content. But you can get pretty specific, and you can make some much more informed decisions about what content to create and when to distribute it.
And I find too the platforms. I mean the data numbers on iPhone and Android usage are massive, but those aren't as monetizable, and they're not as long if you look at duration. And I think not just looking at what to put on those ones, but maybe putting something on one of the mobiles that can drive you to the 10-foot, where you can get the longer adoption and you can get more engagement and hopefully monetize that. I think that link isn't necessarily clear to everyone yet either.
Saigon, do you find that your content providers are really crafting specific content that is designed to work with Alexa? Do you engage with them on that level?
Yeah. So we very deliberately designed our sort of spec around RSS. Right, so for many providers, they're able to just sort of take what they have off the shelf and tweak it a little bit and have it work on Alexa. And so we've seen a lot of growth through that. I think the providers that see the biggest sort of reward are those that do sort of are a little bit more thoughtful about, hey, you know what, like how can we take this and make it even, how can we optimize for voice? A very clear example I think is around. So with Alexa, you can, and news specifically, you can have her play a specific audio podcast or a video clip, but Alexa can also read the news, right? So if you send her text, she'll read the news. Some providers will just sort of take the content they have for visual reading and send that to Alexa to read out. Content designed for visual reading is not necessarily the same content, or best content for listening, right? You want shorter sentences with better prosody and that sort of thing. And so, we do see content providers optimize for Alexa, and I think that's absolutely what you should be doing. This isn't a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach.
Has it been an education curve for you, for Amazon to tell partners what works and what? Do you have a lot of feedback? that way?
Absolutely. I mean, it's we have a saying at Amazon that it's always day one, and I think that's especially true here with Alexa. It's a new interface. It's a new way of interacting. We're learning as well ourselves in these early days, and we try to pass on those learnings to our providers as much as we can as well.
One other thing, of course, that defines the digital universe compared to linear television or content is of course the importance of distribution partnerships and kind of letting your content live on other platforms or piggyback or partner with people from Snapchat to doing something with an Alexa. Is that a hard mindset to get out of, considering that exclusivity and control and that linear control of when your product was going out, even if it's a 24/7 MSNBC, versus I'm going to craft this and it's going to be carried on a couple of different partners? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly in the Snap example, but it's been true of others as well. We found that if you try and do the sort of mass distribution play where you create one thing and you try and get it out on as many partners as you can, distribute it through the AOL network or do something with a Yahoo or whatever, I think the experience ends up being not as good. If you tailor it to either an exclusive partner or a smaller number of partners, then you have the opportunity to learn from the partner as you go, and they tell you about their audience, they tell you what's going to work, what isn't going to work, and you end up with a much, much better product at the end. So I don't think it's been a hard shift in mindset. I think it's just been understanding how to get the most out of those partnerships.
And I think I would agree. I think I will say platform specificity, or making that each platform has different audiences, and even when there's audience crossover, there's different expectations of the content they're going to consume. That's a big piece. I think the really interesting thing, or the light bulb for a lot of content makers and companies like ours, is really when you can reach a scale and a type of audience that you couldn't have otherwise. So Twitter's 54 million users. If you working with Twitter, you can reach, and about 3/4 of them probably, I think, or 3/4 of all social media users use Twitter for news. So if you want to be news adjacent like we do, or topical as history, well, there's a whole audience that probably wouldn't have come, or some of the audience might not have come to the History Channel. So, or Snapchat, making shows for Snapchat, reaching these audiences of teenagers that we like to reach, but we don't reach quite as often with Lifetime History and A&E. So, yeah, I think once people see the opportunity, even short of monetization, just the audience and the kind of like the opportunity to be seen in a different light, I think it's not that hard to get there.
How do you, on the content people side, how do you measure the success of this?
Because
right now, I mean, you're doing the linear, now you're doing digital, and I agree, like the History Channel, there's so much rich data you could deliver and bring up at interesting times. Then you got to tweet about it, then you've got to do a Snapchat, now you've got to do an Alexa version of it. How do you measure that and know when you're putting too much, too little, pick your battles? Is that too early?
Well, I mean, ultimately, we're all in the game. Long term, you measure it by profitability. Right, but in the short term, you are, the ROI calculation's harder. It's clearly about developing and driving audience, which you think will result in short or long-term revenue. But it's not an easy question. It's a cop-out answer, but not an easy question.
No, but I do think there's some basics. If it's got an audience, then at least you can kind of give it one thumbs up, and then you worry about the monetization next. But there are certainly examples where you'll produce something and it just isn't the right piece of content for that platform or that audience at that time. And the nice thing is you get to know pretty quickly. It's the new old adage of fail fast, and I think that's helpful.
And you're right. And the other thing is that there are a few less zeros attached to the price of making that content generally. So the mistakes are maybe not that big. Fail fast, fail slightly more inexpensively.
Fail cheaply. Yeah.
And so now and again, I think this is one of the challenges across the board. You are great content companies. You had to be great at tech, maybe do tech. Now you also have to be great at data analytics and stuff too. It's an interesting world.
It's very hard to be us.
And plenty of.
That's what I was trying to say. Good job. We have it easy.
Plenty of people out there to help you with those data analytics. I would like to just follow up on that. Is there? and this may be too simplistic, but I would imagine it might be different for different types of content, but do you care more about, somebody who completes a view of whatever the program is? Do you care about the amount of sampling? Do you care about the total level of engagement? Did somebody tweet about this? Did somebody post on Instagram? Like, what are the metrics that you all look at most and think are most telling for when a piece of content is really resonating?
So overall, the loyalty is basically the foundation of our entire strategy. We're not necessarily, in most cases, we're not looking for the biggest possible audience we can get. If a ton of people come to something, watch only a few seconds, and don't come back, we don't consider that a success. I would much prefer to see a smaller audience return to it over and over and over again.
You want consistency of audience.
Consistency, but also I think the difference between consistency and loyalty is that level of passion. So you do want a kind of not just a transactional loyalty, but a little bit of heartfelt loyalty. And I think that's where you start to layer on top of basic analytics. You look at things like comments in social and how much are people sharing. And
you've got to see this.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
One of the things we look at is just, are we increasing the engagement with the consumer based on the recommendation? And that's our key metric of success, because if we can have the consumer engage with the content, watching longer, of course that creates more monetizable units for the ad sales organization. And when we've done some of our recent testing, when you are doing effective recommendations, it really works and can increase viewership by up to 30%. And so keeping someone engaged with the content, interested in it, serving up the right piece, they will watch longer, which of course benefits the whole ecosystem.
Right. Yes, I can use.
Yeah, no, I absolutely resonate with sort of creating content that has might have a small audience, but is extremely sticky, right? Because you add up all those small audiences and you have a big audience, right? And the sort of the bridge there is really great personalization, right? And I think you've seen that with Alexa as well in terms of the content we bring on. It's really about the long tail and filling our selection with all sorts of unique and hyperlocal and special interest pieces of content, and then eventually getting the right piece of content to the right customer, and those add up to a big overall audience.
How do you test whether your personalization is working well? Because we've all had the experience where somebody serves up something to you where you scoff and you're like, I wouldn't watch this in a million years. And then sort of subconsciously you think, well, that the recommendations aren't that strong. Do you focus group test it? Like, how do you know if your technology, if what you are serving up is resonating with your target viewer?
Within our platform, we measure that by the next click. Like, did they click on the next video? There's a ton of noise there, right? Because there's all the things that aren't an actual quality click, and so you have to get to actual quality. Was it a quality view? So did somebody physically click on that play, or was it an autoplay? Like, filtering that out. That's how we measure our algorithm.
Yeah, and you can do all sorts of A/B testing, and all of this feeds into machine learning predictions, and so it's never solved. I think the answer is we just keep getting better at it and tuning these algorithms.
Yeah, I would add one more. So we're primarily, web and mobile is where we get a lot of our data. We look at the CPM too. So did somebody interact with the next video? Can we learn something from the CPM for the ad on that next video?
Yeah, look, ultimately, like you guys were saying, ultimately this is about bringing people to your site or to your feed or what have you, and keeping them there for as many views or videos or however you want to kind of frame it as possible. And I think the quality of your recommendation vehicle is it can be a driver there. Obviously, the quality of your content, topicality of your content's a piece there too. But yeah, the holy grail is they just, even if it's a small audience, they're there and they just stay there and they keep cranking out views, and ultimately that drives monetization.
Yeah, and then being able to track that user and know that they might have left and come back.
Yeah.
So that loyalty piece that you guys were talking about.
And then, and I guess the only other thing is then, and being able to, on some level, attribute, if you work with advertisers, it's being able to, on some level, attribute either a purchase decision or an engagement with a product to the holy grail being, to the linkage between that and they're advertising with you or they're partnering with you.
Yeah, you know, the other sort of nuanced thing here about personalization recommendations with voice UI is when you don't have a screen, there isn't that skimming experience, right? When you think about a desktop or an app, customers are skimming and then they find the piece of content that they really want to engage with and they go deep in that. And so for me, that's a message that we really need to have even a higher bar for personalization, because you know what, when you don't get the personalization or recommendation right, the customer is having to listen through a piece of content they don't like, right, for several minutes, or stop it altogether, which is sort of the worst outcome here.
So you guys are all talking like your friends here, but there is a bit of a conflict, right? You both want to own the user. You both want to make the decision where they're going. You're both talking about analytics, but you're both talking about owning them in different boxes. Like, do you see that as a real issue going forward, that the platforms want to own the users and do recommendations? So do you, or is that have a friendly play long term?
Is there enough data to go around? I guess it sounds like.
I mean, data, eventually you'll all get it all eventually. I think that's a given. But you know,
isn't this for a lot of us? Isn't it the kind of partnership or the partner intensiveness of the model, however you want to put it? Isn't this it's historically, it's always been that way, right? So like when you think about pay TV content players, historically pay TV content players like us, we've always relied on big platforms to help us deliver the messages to consumers. And I think, yes, there's a richer mix. There are hybrids where you direct consumer or quasi-direct consumer through different platforms. But in the end, it's like this ecosystem still requires multiple levels of cooperation and aligning agendas at some level.
Clearly, we could talk about this probably for another hour. We are short on time now, but I really want to thank everybody for coming and really engaging in a good, healthy discussion. I so appreciate it. Thank you.